March, Book 3, by John Lewis and Andrew Aydin. Illustrated by Nate Powell. Pages 128 through 145. SNCC was falling apart. We were burned out. Harry Belafonte, a longtime SNCC supporter, could see the strain taking its toll and wanted to help. Belafonte invited a delegation from SNCC to accompany him on a 3-week trip to Africa to speak to young people and share ideas about what we were doing in the American South. We jumped at the chance. Dakar, Senegal. It was my first visit to Africa. Really, it was the first time I ever left the United States. Fannie Lou Hamer went. So did Bob and Donna Moses, Bill Hansen, Prathia Hall, Matthew Jones, Ruby Robinson, and Jim Foreman, of course. My close friends Julian Bond and Don Harris went too. Sometimes when you learn a word in another language, it changes the meaning of that word for you in your own language. A toast. Uhuru. Uhuru! Uhuru means freedom. Hearing that word over and over, I began to understand more deeply than ever how we are all connected in the unending quest to be free. Welcome aboard. I had been on airplane after airplane in the United States, but never before in my life had I seen a black pilot, let alone two. From Dakar, we flew south to Guinea, and that was just the beginning. Guinea was basically a vacation for our group, but Don Harris and I made arrangements with an organization called the American Committee on Africa to extend our stay. While the others went home, we would visit other African nations to meet with other young activists like ourselves. Don had become one of my closest friends. A year earlier, he spent 100 days in prison in Americus, Georgia, facing a death sentence for seditious conspiracy. In other words, lying down during a nonviolent protest. He would eventually be the best man at my wedding. We traveled first to Liberia, then Ghana and Ethiopia. It was liberating to be two young black men, Americans, meeting so many other young people awash in the rising global tide of revolution. This is John Lewis and Don Harris. They are leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in America. For young people we met were very astute and far more radical than those of us in the SNCC. What is your organization's relationship with Malcolm's? Malcolm X, they always asked. He struck a chord with the young revolutionaries. Look, you guys might really be doing something, but if you're to the right of Malcolm, you might as well start packing now, because no one will listen to you. It was eye-opening. Back home, we were considered the radicals, by the press, by most of society, even by the movement. On our way from Ethiopia to Zambia, our plane had mechanical trouble, and we were forced to land in Kenya. The airline put us up in the New Stanley Hotel in Nairobi. I'll never forget. Hello, John. What are you doing here? It was Malcolm X. Malcolm, it's good to see you. This is my friend, Don Harris. Please sit down. Thank you. Earlier that year, Malcolm had split from Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam. He seemed a little anxious. Malcolm had come from a conference in Cairo, where he spoke about bringing the problems of black people in America before the United Nations. He said we have to identify with the people of Africa, and that they must identify with us. The struggle in Africa is inseparable from our struggle in America. What moved me and impressed me was his sensitivity to the fact that our being in Africa was very dangerous for us. He knew that there were people back in America who did not like us trying to link the movement in Africa to what was happening in America. On several occasions, he suggested that we sit with our backs to the wall so we could see anyone approaching us. Would you like to continue this conversation in my room, where we can speak in private? He talked about his impressions of Cairo and about certain African leaders, but mostly he talked to us about what we were doing. Malcolm talked about the need to shift our focus from race to class, both among one another and between ourselves and the white community. He said that he believed that was the root of our problems, not just in America, but all over the world. Malcolm was saying, in effect, that it is a struggle for the poor, those who have been left out and left behind, and that it transcends race. I support what you're doing in the South. Don't give up. This is an ongoing struggle. Be prepared for the worst, but keep it up. Keep fighting. People are changing. There are people all over the world supporting you. I had no way of knowing then, but that was the last time I would see Malcolm alive. After 3 days, our plane was ready, and we went back to Zambia, then back through Kenya and Ethiopia. We arrived in Addis Ababa just in time for the presidential election back in the States. We listened to the results on a Voice of America broadcast. It appears Johnson is on his way to a landslide victory, winning 44 of 50 states and dominating the Electoral College. Despite everything, I was happy that Johnson won, and particularly excited when it was announced that Robert Kennedy had won the Senate seat in New York. Our last stop in Africa was in Cairo, where we decided it was time to play tourist. As the sun set behind the pyramids, we rode in silence. I couldn't help but feel lonely, even a little sad, at the thought of what awaited us back in America. After 72 days of travels, we returned home on November 22nd. A lot had changed while we were gone. Many people thought I'd been away too long. SNCC was threatening to collapse under its own weight. All the things that made SNCC what it was, decentralized leadership, consensus-driven decision-making, respect for individuality, were now tearing it apart. We had always been a close-knit group. I thought of us as a band of brothers and sisters, a circle of trust. But the Mississippi Summer Project had swelled our numbers significantly. The intimacy that allowed for decision-making by consensus had all but disappeared. Salt-of-the-earth field staff chafed against college-educated intellectuals, pushing a more political agenda. Just before I got back, SNCC held a staff retreat in Waveland, Mississippi, to address some of these challenges. Mary King and Casey Hayden submitted a paper called The Position of Women in the Movement. Assumptions of male superiority are as widespread and deep-rooted, and every much as crippling to the woman as assumptions of white supremacy are to the Negro. As more and more women joined the movement, the question of gender equality took hold as powerfully as any challenge within SNCC. After all the papers were presented and the retreat had adjourned for the day, Stokely Carmichael and some of the SNCC staffers were blowing off steam. What is the position of women in SNCC? The position of women in SNCC is prone. It was a joke, really, but it so perfectly captured what so many were feeling that the comment took on a life of its own. Back in Atlanta, Dawn and I wrote lengthy reports on our experiences in Africa that were disseminated among the SNCC leadership. Then I gave a series of interviews to the press to spread our message and combat dangerous rumors swirling about our tactics and membership. Can you tell me why a delegation of high-ranking SNCC members traveled to Africa? It matters not whether it is in Angola, Mozambique, Southwest Africa, or Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Harlem, USA. The struggle is the same. It is the struggle against a vicious and evil system that is controlled and kept in order for and by a few white men throughout the world. On December 4th, word came that Sheriff Rainey, Deputy Price, and 19 other men were arrested in connection with the Mississippi murders. At a hearing 6 days later, Judge Harold Cox, the same judge who earlier called us a bunch of chimpanzees, dismissed the charges against Rainey, Price, and the 19 others. That same day, Dr. King became the youngest person to ever receive a Nobel Peace Prize, and only the second African American after diplomat Ralph Bunche in 1950. I was overjoyed for Dr. King's honor, but most of my colleagues in SNCC resented it. Frankly, a lot of my colleagues resented me. I could feel SNCC becoming more and more isolated from the movement. I didn't get to stay home long. Clink! SNCC was running out of money. Donors who'd supported us through the summer project were increasingly hesitant to continue offering funding. Rumors swirled that SNCC had been taken over by communists, and that our recent trip was a ruse to cover a secret visit to China. It's called red baiting, and it's always deeply bothered me. If you're going to call someone a name or slap a label on them, have a reason. Even if it's racist, I can respect that. But calling someone a communist or a socialist is the intellectual equivalent of throwing from your back foot. You're not putting much on the ball. I went on a fundraising trip to Philadelphia and New York to try to turn things around. John, you have to tell me. I heard SNCC is going to break up. Is it true? No, it's not true. What's this I've been hearing about an attempted coup against SNCC leadership? No, just some very spirited meetings at a recent conference. When I got back from the trip, I decided to write a letter to the entire membership, addressing many of the rumors I'd heard. I wasn't panicking, but I was as close to it as I've ever been. I tried to address the rumors as directly as possible, dispel any notion that I might be leaving as chairman, and lay out my plan for visiting all the SNCC-led projects over the next few weeks. I've always seen myself as a doer. Carl, and in moments like that, would you mind helping me make copies of this letter to send out? The only thing that made sense to me was to keep moving. Right on. Who we sending it to? Everybody. So I went on the road for the next several weeks until I found myself back in the heart of Dallas County, Alabama. Selma. As significant as it was, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made no provision to ensure the rights of African Americans to register to vote. In more than 2 years of SNCC-led work organizing and protesting in Selma, we registered fewer than 100 new voters. And thanks to Judge Hare's injunction against public gatherings, SNCC's operation in Selma had ground to a halt. Dr. King met with President Johnson in December, shortly after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. They discussed the need for a Voting Rights Act, but President Johnson said it was impossible. The votes in Congress were simply not there. Johnson said, in effect, if you want a Voting Rights Act, make me do it. When Dr. King returned to Atlanta, he accepted an invitation from an organization called the Dallas County Improvement Association, requesting SCLC to help the people of Selma.